next day I got demoted down here to the freaking island of misfit toys!
The prototype seems to possess an unprecedented level of intelligence, as well as an alarming willingness to commit violence.
Rich is also temperamental, flying into these aggressive moods with very little prompting.
It's just hard to be happy about it when manufacturing's on our necks about it, because we can't fight stupid hockey boxes!
Which is exactly how Leith Pierre described the prototype during the Chapter 3 ARG, temperamental. Now, we know these experiments can lose their memories, like Thomas Clark did during the Restoration VHS, but most experiments do retain some kind of core personality traits. For example, Catnap has unwavering faith in the prototype, something he had back when he was the orphan Theodore. And so the prototype being aggressive tracks with Rich's predisposition. There's also the prototype's initial goal, which seems to be stopping more toys from being made, stopping children from being experimented on.
They are trying to build more toys, more like you. It has to be stopped.
Which again ties into Rich's protective attitude towards these orphans.
Don't you think these kids deserve some real sunlight instead of floodlights and painted skies?
But once again, that's all interpretation. Mapping one character's emotions onto another isn't exactly solid proof. However, there is one more piece of evidence that I think ties Rich to the prototype in a pretty undeniable way. Outside the Playcare Dome, we can find Catnap worshipping the prototype at a shrine that's built using scrap metal and toy parts. But what's interesting about it is this part right at the front, a human skeleton, acting as the head of this abomination. But it's not just any skeleton either. This skeleton is wearing a hard hat. I know, that's seems like a really random detail, but think back to all the tapes we found of Rich so far. Each one has been found in the location that Rich was working in. Chapter 1 was the storage room, Chapter 2 was the rejected toy room, and in Chapter 3 we find his tape inside the cave next to toolboxes, construction platforms, and builder's lights. Rich was working in construction, likely after being demoted again from the rejected toy department. Now, I'm not saying that this skeleton is Rich. Instead, I'm saying that much like this shrine is symbolically showing us the prototype and how it's made of lots of toys, this skeleton is symbolically trying to tell us that Rich, a construction worker, is the human inside the prototype. A man who was angry at the company for destroying the lives of these innocent children, and so given the opportunity, took revenge. It also lines up pretty well from a timeline perspective. It might be easy to think that if Rich became the prototype, he couldn't be angry at the company or their experiments, as the children weren't turned into toys until after the prototype was made. But that isn't necessarily the case. Remember, the prototype is experiment 1006, and in Elliot Ludwig's office, there's a note talking about the experiment using poppy gel to revive dead rats. It's the one that has the line about using larger subjects, i.e. children. This test was labeled 814, almost 200 experiments before the prototype came into existence, meaning there were 200 failed experiments before they found success. This is what Rich discovered, the plans to turn these kids into monsters. Maybe he even witnessed those 200 experiments fail, the lives of those orphans lost in the pursuit of science, innovation, and cheap labor. So he did what he always did. He complained. He tried to get it shut down, but obviously it didn't work, and Playtime Co. did the only thing they could do to stop him going to the press. They used him as another test subject, helping to create the first successful experiment, 1006. And so he rallied the toys to help him take revenge on those who harmed them, promising them the one thing they'd longed for. That is a clip from the song Sleep Well by CG5, a song made in partnership with Mob Games and was posted to the official Mob Games YouTube channel. It is an absolute bop, but what's more important is the extra lore hints it gives us. The song shows the toys prior to the Hour of Joy, repeating over and over again that they want freedom. This was the reason for rebelling and causing the Hour of Joy. This is what the prototype was promising them, and as we know, they succeed. They kill off all the staff members, they have control of the factory, save the orphans, and yet, when we return, the toys are still here, still serving 1006. They never got their freedom, but why? Well, in the song, we do hear this repeated lyric, an artificial facade from a fraud of a god. And it makes way more sense when you check out the other version of this song that was released on the same day on CG5's channel. The song is exactly the same, but the video is different. It's set after the Hour of Joy, with a destroyed Playtime Co. factory, scratches, dust, and blood lining the walls. The toys are still singing about freedom even now, and so it feels like Mob Games spelling out that 1006, the only character we know that has been compared to a god, is a liar. And we can see this for ourselves in the Chapter 3 death screens. We've believed for a while that these death screens are not coming from just one person, but rather multiple. Most notably, however, any message with capital letters seems to be coming from 1006 himself. And in this game, one of them stood out to me. This research must stay buried. Nobody may leave. He was never going to let the toys leave the factory. Instead, he wants to keep everything locked away. And I get it. I'm not sure the world is going to be super super accepting of a bunch of flesh-eating sentient toys. But more importantly, if all these experiments were done in the pursuit of cheap labor and eternal life, it wouldn't take long for others to try and do the same thing again, harming more children and causing more pain. The toys from Playtime wouldn't be safe either. They would become case zero in these new experiments, picked apart and tortured so they could figure out what makes them tick. It would mean more pain and suffering for those who've already suffered enough. As one of the death messages says, these souls deserve peace, which won't come to them if they are released into the outside world. But clearly they aren't at peace down in the factory either. Like the song shows, they're still begging for freedom all these years later. And now characters like Kissy Missy are helping us because they realize the freedom that 1006 promised them isn't coming. They're turning on him, they're restless, which then leads Catnap to tie up and torture anyone that loses faith, these so-called heretics, like we see with Dog Day. However, it is Catnap who is blinded by his faith, because another death message reads, burn this place to the ground. Combining that with the message from earlier about keeping all the research buried, and I think we have a pretty strong idea of what the prototype is planning. He wants everything the company ever touched destroyed, be it the poor children that got turned into toys, or the executives at the company like us who performed these horrible experiments. All of them must burn along with this place. From his perspective, this is an act of mercy, at least for the toys. They will finally be put to rest. Finally, they will know peace. Which is why while Catnap is suffering during Chapter 3's final boss fight, rather than helping him, the prototype kills him and drags him away. He stopped Catnap's suffering. But for those of us who did these horrible things, we need to see justice. And that is why we are here. We are the last senior employee that remains. We need to pay for our crimes to make sure that the horrors that happened in this place never happen again. But for that to work, he'd need to lure us here, to put us in dangerous scenarios we likely won't escape from. Something that stood out to me was the final tape we receive in this chapter, a tape from Harley Sawyer, the doctor, the one who started the Bigger Bodies Initiative, talking to 1006. There are a couple of key details in this tape, like the fact the prototype occasionally slips from singular pronouns to plurals.
I possess.
A question. You stick us.
Beat us.
Tear at flesh.
Do you feel it?
Which does make sense when you consider he's adding other toys to himself, making them part of him, like Mummy Longlegs told us. But the big takeaway for me was this last section.
Regardless, I learn something new about you every day.
Thank you.
You thank me.
Absolutely.
I learn something new about you every day.
1006 has the ability to mimic voices, and specifically voices he's heard, rather than just voices of the people that are a part of him. That is the last thing they tell us about 1006 in this chapter. It's literally the parting words we get from these VHS tapes, which again tells me they're important to bear in mind when we look back at this chapter. And while I could make a joke about there being a robot that can mimic people down in the basement seeming a little bit familiar, I'm gonna hold off because it actually ties into another character I promised to talk about today, our new helper, Ollie. Ollie felt like a weird addition to me in this chapter, and not just because he sounds exactly like Gregory from Security Breach.
Hey, can you hear me?
Gregory?
I'm kinda lost.
Is that Gregory?
Gregory? Someone said Gregory. Stop. Not Gregory.
Gregory? You made it here? Oh no!
Who's this? Gregory? No.
Check this out. Look at the two.
Gregory.
Yeah, you're not really helping the whole FNAF connection here, Mob Games. Regardless, I found his presence odd purely because of one crucial detail. He's a child. The factory has been abandoned for 10 years. Any child that somehow survived this long would be at least a tween at this point. And he does have to be inside the factory as well. Otherwise, how does he send us keys to the various parts of the playcare? It also seems unlikely that this is just a toy with a child's voice. Every toy we've encountered, Mummy, Poppy, Dog Day, all have adult voices. So if he was a toy, he wouldn't sound the way he does. But then, who is he? Simple. I'm suggesting that Ollie is a voice that the prototype is using to deceive us and Poppy. There's this drawing from Chapter 2 that shows a child playing with all the bigger bodies, and in it, you can actually see Poppy standing there playing with the child. Poppy is the one that tells us to trust Ollie, which makes me think that he might have been a child she played with in the facility, and that's why she's willing to trust him. Plus, if you go through the game files and look at previous maps, you can find a room in Home Sweet Home called Ollie's room, meaning he was a real child in the playcare at some point, which would have allowed 1006 to mimic him. And here's the thing, up until now, we've managed to escape both the likes of Huggy Wuggy and Mummy Longlegs without any help from anyone. Why now do we suddenly need help to get through the playcare? Sure, Ollie does have all the keys to the facility, but when it actually comes to things like puzzles and monsters, he doesn't offer us any help or advice. He goes quiet and just leaves us to it. The only time he speaks to us is telling us where to go next, leading us into more and more danger. When you beat Catnap, you also get this weird line.
Wow, you did